Thank you, Chiefter, for those messages. I think we're just going to go ahead and keep moving along. So in the words of Chiefter, hopefully these next two panels that we're going to end with today add some of those tools to your cup and some lessons that can really impact your work in a broader way. And so this next panel is focused on equity in disaster and wildfire preparedness, and we have 3 speakers. And how this is going to go is we're going to have each of them up kind of present for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll invite them all up for a Q&A for questions from you all and some guided questions. So I'm going to start with Christina Greene, who's based out of the University of Arizona, and she's a research scientist in this field.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's caffeined up and ready for a third day. I just want to say thank you to the organizers. It's been such a privilege to be here and to learn from so many different people here, and it's exciting to see this event happen. So I'm a social scientist with CLEMAS, and CLEMAS is a NOAA-funded research program that does collaborative research with decision makers, community members, land managers who need more and better information about climate impacts here in the Southwest. And one of the things that we work on is ensuring that there's equity and access to climate information. And we know that the impacts of wildfire in communities go far beyond how many acres were burned, how many structures were destroyed. Here in Arizona, post-fire floods can even be more devastating to a community than the fire itself. There are many livelihood impacts, especially for communities dependent on tourism and on basically the economics of the region. One thing that we've heard a lot about the past few days is insurance and how that impacts different households and people. There can be impacts on the tax revenue for a community after a fire. There are health and mental health impacts. The experience of an evacuation can be so traumatic that people will decide to move away from that community, and that has implications for the long term of who lives in the WUI and who doesn't. And who is prepared, who is impacted, and who has the resources to recover from wildfire is not an equal process. So here we have the concept of equity, which is equal access to environmental goods and services regardless of your identity or background. And we know we don't live in an equal society. And disaster events such as wildfire, what they do is they amplify existing societal inequities. So people who are already having a hard time are often the ones who are worse off after a fire. And we know that wildfire resilience and adaptation is a constant, ongoing event. And it involves many different phases. You're always constantly preparing for the next possibility of a fire. You're responding to a current wildfire emergency, or you're in the recovery process. And often you see kind of disaster management literature has them as like very distinct processes, but they're ongoing all the time. They're always influencing each other. And across these different phases of wildfire adaptation, there are instances when people don't have the same access to goods and services. And today I want to go through all of it, but I want to just highlight some examples of some research that has been done on equity issues around wildfire adaptation and resilience. So when it comes to preparedness and equity, there are several studies that show that some populations or groups of people or community members are often left out of the wildfire preparedness and planning. So when it comes to hazard mitigation, renters, low-income households, they often are most vulnerable to wildfire, but clearing, thinning trees, using fire-resistant materials in the homes can be financially impossible for these households. There's often difficulty in engaging with absentee landlords. That has effect on the renters. And it increases exposure to wildfire for these people. There's another study that looked at community wildfire protection plans across the West. And it shows that consultations in the development of these plans often fail to include a lot of underserved communities, especially non-English speakers or groups in a community that have high poverty rates. And so to have greater equity, we really need to include these people in preparedness. There was a great session on the FireWise materials and kind of the information that's put out there. And you were kind of critiquing the fact that the portrayal of these houses aren't even showing, like, you know, the landscape vegetation that we have, but also think about what kind of houses are portrayed. You know, if you're just putting like McMansion images on these houses, does that mean that being FireWise is only for, you know, people of higher income? Or how do we, you know, create materials that is going to involve the whole community, and thinking that being FireWise is for them as well? So during a wildfire response, there are a lot of equity issues that come up as well. And a really great example of this is the 2017 Thomas Fire in California. And this is in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And anyone who knows these counties, there's a lot of agricultural labor in these counties, and actually 9% of the population are undocumented workers who are working either on farms or in service jobs. And during the fire in 2017, all the emergency response information on evacuation areas, shelters, road closures were only issued in English. And it took several days for them to be issued in Spanish. And what some of the research has shown is that a lot of farm workers don't even speak Spanish. They actually come from indigenous groups in Mexico or in Central America, and a lot of them are illiterate. So you need to think about what kind of messaging needs to be distributed over the radio and indigenous languages. So now Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, because of the 2017 fire, they have full-time Spanish-speaking public information officers. Another issue comes with air quality. So there's a lot of information coming out on the negative health impacts of exposure to smoke, especially when it comes, there are a lot of cardiovascular impacts, there's heart disease, and some of this information is really coming out. And so people who work outdoors, so on a farm, on landscaping crews, are disproportionately affected by this smoke. And so we need to ensure that messaging around air quality and use of N95 masks are translated and appropriate to the local community. And of course, recovery. So everyone's pretty familiar with the Camp Fire in 2018 in California that burned a lot of the communities, including Paradise. And it was a study looking at 1 year after the event and who has recovered and who's having the greatest difficulty in recovery. And once again, it comes down to renters. There's more aid available for you if you own your home than if you rent a home. And for all the people who had to evacuate and leave, there was a lot of running for what available rentals in the greater area was. So there was a lot of price gouging. And so 1 year afterwards, people who previously lived in rentals were still living in RVs. And so we really need to think about what kind of aid we have available for people who don't own their home. Securing recovery aid can be really inequitable. So if there's a FEMA emergency and there's FEMA aid, it actually requires a lot of technology, really knowing how to work through technology, and a certain level of literacy with a lot of financial forms. People with informal rental agreements are left out of access to recovery aid. Families with multi-generational households often receive less aid in proportion to other households. And so there's a great, in Ruidoso, there's a community foundation, and they have established a separate fund that is just for post-fire and flooding recovery, and for nothing else. And because they've had many events over the years, and so when there is an event, they are able to go and they know who lives in that community full-time, not necessarily people who have Airbnb, and they're able to put that aid out there immediately without having to rely on longer-term and slow aid. So, in order to move towards more equitable wildfire resilience, we really need to engage with these underserved populations more. But that can be difficult. It's not easy. If you remember, one thing is it requires looking through invisibilities. Even WUI communities who are seen as wealthy, and they have a lot of capacity to recover from an event, they're often people who are working in these communities who are going to need extra assistance to ensure that they're not worse off of the event than before. When we conduct risk assessments, it's important to include social as well as physical dimensions of risk. You know, we're talking, just this morning talking about we need data. Well, we need social data as well. And not necessarily being like the numbers of people, but we need people's lived experiences. We need to listen to everyone in the community. It's really important to understand the historical context of the community. Across here, the Southwest, we work in Arizona, New Mexico, rural community can be so different. It can be so different when you're considering Las Vegas and New Mexico versus Flagstaff versus Globe. These are all very different areas, and we understand that the history shape how people experience wildfire in these regions and how they recover. For example, after the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon, the acequias have been really instrumental in the recovery there. So we have to understand how the community can recover together. Trust building and transparency is vital. You have to spend time to listen and build trust, and be really transparent about services you can and cannot offer. Engage these relationships with humility and respect people's knowledges and experiences. And it really comes down to partnering often with local professionals or trusted community members. And ensure that you're, not just, partnerships can be really difficult, and it requires a lot of time and investment, and ensuring that your partners also have the resources to assist you in this endeavor. So thank you. Please feel free to contact me. And if anyone wants copies of these studies, I know it can be really frustrating that a lot of academic research is behind a paywall. And so I'm happy to pass anything on. Please feel free to contact me. So great, thank you.
Hello? Oh. Good morning. Let's get out in front of the chairs. I like to be up and moving. Go ahead. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and good morning. This has to be like the biggest room I've spoken to, and I'm really nervous. So my name is Stephanie Miller. I'm the Emergency Preparedness Equity Educator, long title, for the Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council. Long name. You can't see it, but my badge says happy to be here on the yellow ribbon, which I am very happy to be here. Plus, I couldn't find the one that says I'm kind of a big deal. So, but I'll let Vicki introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vicki Cuscino. I am Executive Director of Direct Advocacy and Resource Center, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. And I also serve on the Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council. And then as far as other background, I think you can read about it in the brochure.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I know.
So we're going to go with, we're going to talk about equality versus equity. And you see in the little picture here, equality means everybody has the same thing. And in order to kind of be, have access to over the barriers, right? So you can't quite tell, but the person that's using a wheelchair has a box in front of them as well. So equality is everyone gets the level and type of, equity, everyone gets the level of support that they need. So then now the tall person doesn't have a box because at this point they don't need one. The shorter person or child has a couple of boxes so they can see over the fence, and then the person that uses the wheelchair has a ramp. And then justice means that everyone has access without adjustments, so no barriers at all.
And I just want to add, I see some of you taking pictures. You're free to do that, but we will get you a copy of the slide deck if anybody wants it. And one other thing about this, we've sort of moved beyond equality toward equity, which I think is really important. And any of the federal and state laws that address access and functional needs and disability really focus on equity, making sure people get what they need. But I'd love to talk to you another day about the third side, which, justice or universal access, universal design, because if we don't create the barriers in the first place, we don't have to spend a lot of money and other resources on doing remediation and removing them. That's my little advertisement for universal design.
So we're moving into access and functional needs here, and in the outer circle you see a whole community. A lot of you are familiar with that term. Within the whole community, there are folks who have access and functional needs, so they could be limited English proficiency, children, older adults, people that are unhoused. And then within that circle, there are folks who have disabilities. So you don't necessarily have to have a disability to have an access and functional need.
So the definition of disability, and you might wonder why we're doing this, but we sometimes get aha moments over this. And this is based on the legal definition under the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, 508, and similar laws. But a disability under the law is something that limits a major life activity. And major life activities are things we do every day, like talking, moving around, eating, breathing, communicating. It could be major bodily functions, chronic health conditions. I think sometimes when we say disability, what's the image? You immediately see a wheelchair, right? Because that's the universal access symbol. But there are many, many disabilities. And so really what it is you have something that creates a functional need. So you could have two people that have exactly the same disabilities. For example, I have two friends who have very high level spinal cord injuries, same level complete injuries, but their function is different. And it was kind of funny the first time they met, they were joking around, they're like, whoa, you can do that with your right arm, I can't do that, And it's the same thing, two people with diabetes or schizophrenia, it manifests differently in everybody. And then under the law, like the ADA also protects people who have a record or history of disability. So that could be somebody with cancer in remission, multiple sclerosis in remission, or people who are regarded as having a disability. And we don't have time to go into all that, but during questions, if you have a question, or I can talk to you after about that. And this slide just shows, how many people have disabilities in the United States. And the estimate is 1 in 4 adults, so about 26%. However, my caveat to that is these come from census statistics and studies, and that leaves out anybody living in an institution, so nursing facilities, jails, prisons, as well as active military. And so just taking nursing facilities, there's about 1.2 million people in the United States living in nursing facilities. And they usually say about 99% have disabilities, so those people don't get counted. I would argue that 100% have disabilities because nobody goes into a nursing facility because they aged into it and just went to live there, right? We go into nursing facilities because of disability.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Arizona Independent Living Network, who we are, and kind of a little bit about what we do. So I am with the Statewide Independent Living Council, and then we have 5 centers for independent living, of which Vicki is the executive director of one. So go ahead. So we promote resources, opportunities, and experiences which empower people with disabilities to live independently. Now, we develop and monitor and implement and evaluate what we call the State Plan for Independent Living, or the SPIL. And we do that along with the Centers for Independent Living, or we call them the CILs. And we are known as AZ SILC. So it's federally mandated under the Rehabilitation Act. There are 56 SILCs in each state and territory. So if you're not from Arizona here, you do have a SILC in your state or your territory. And then they are government-appointed members, and the majority of the folks have disabilities. So with AZ SILC, we have 13 council members, I believe, and 4 administrative staff, of which I am one. So it's important to know that not every SILC has an administrative staff, let alone somebody who does emergency preparedness for them. So we're really lucky to be able to have that. So when we're talking about the SPIL, we just had the new SPIL for 2025 through 2027. And what I want to point out is the part of this bill that's about emergency preparedness. So we serve as a catalyst for systemic change related to disability and emergency preparedness, response, recovery, and resilience. So that is one of the goals of this bill, along with many other things. So again, not a whole lot of SILCs have emergency preparedness in their SPIL. They should, but some of them don't. So we're going to advance community preparedness. So we have an emergency preparedness committee within the SILC, of which Vicki is also a member of the committee. And then we coordinate the Access and Functional Needs Task Force. So there is a statewide Access and Functional Needs Task Force that includes the Department of Emergency and Military Affairs, the Arizona Department of Health Services, AZ SILC, Direct Advocacy and Resource Center, some other centers for independent living, and any other disability service providers, as well as parent advocates. And then, I can't read the last one.
Engaging in environmental justice, education, and advocacy.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say, we're really proud of this state plan for independent living. I've lived in multiple states, and I'm trying to slow my speech down. I'm from the East Coast. If anybody's from the East Coast, you can probably tell. That's why I have to move my hands around and talk fast. And I've been working in disability rights now for over 2 decades, so I'll really date myself, right? And this is my second social justice movement. But I can tell you that, our state plan is really pretty progressive compared to a lot of states. And the fact that our SILC has formed a 501c3 nonprofit and is able to do these things like organize and do education around emergency preparedness and other issues is fairly unique across the country. So the Arizona CILs, Centers for Independent Living, I am not going to read all this to you. We put it up there, and we'll get you the slide deck in case you want to find the Center for Independent Living closest to you. There are 5 centers that serve all of the counties in Arizona, and I will say, why am I missing it? Oh, the second one, Assist to Independence. Actually, it is, I have to give a shout out to them. They're on Navajo Nation, but they serve also Hopi and other tribes, and cross into 3 states. So they serve all of Navajo Nation, and they're one of our smallest centers and have very little funding. And if you know that area, it's very rural, and they do a phenomenal job with the resources that they have. But you can see all of the centers serve multiple counties. Now, just as a comparison, when I said we're very progressive with the state plan, we're not so with funding for Centers for Independent Living. Some states actually provide state funding. So like in Pennsylvania, we had close to 20 centers because there were state-funded centers and federally funded. So, but we do what we can, and okay. And so the Center for Independent Living model, What's different about centers from other social service or human service organizations are a couple things. We're operated by and for people with disabilities. So a majority of both our board, staff, and leadership team must have disabilities. And that is a federal mandate under the Rehabilitation Act, but also according to our philosophy. We're community-based, non-residential. We believe in our homes, not nursing homes. We want people to be able to live, thrive, and age in their own homes. And we see ourselves very much as part of a grassroots social change movement, disability rights and justice. That's how we organized and how the first funding came about, and we still engage in those social justice efforts. In fact, as far as I know, we're the only entity that is actually mandated to do advocacy. So that is one of the core services for Centers for Independent Living. And the last point is, we've been around for a long time, over 50 years since centers started forming. And we now have a network of the federally funded centers of over 400 in all the states and territories. And then again, there are other centers that are state funded in some areas. Oh, and the last thing I missed on that first bullet area is the way we provide services is different. So, I have multiple disabilities, but I am still not an expert on any other disabled person's life. Like, we see each individual as the expert on their own life. We're there to provide education, support, talk about all viable options and help people work through making an informed choice. We never tell people what to do. It's all about, trying to empower people to take control of their own lives and make decisions that impact their lives. And you know what? If you mess up, it's okay. Don't we all mess up? And those are like the biggest lessons in life, right? The mistakes that you make. Well, disabled people have an absolute right to screw up and learn from those mistakes just like everybody else. Is this you or me? Okay, so a little bit more about our philosophy. I think I kind of covered this. We see ourselves as the experts, have the same rights, freedoms as non-disabled people. And independence means different things to different people, and that's part of it too. That, even people who come to this center, whatever independence means for them and what their life goals are, we embrace and support them in that. She keeps kicking it to me. So this is another slogan of the disability rights movement, and one that we particularly like: nothing about us without us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I think Christina was talking about it as well. It's important to involve people from all areas of the community in, planning and implementing, evaluating all aspects. And so from a disability rights perspective, we don't like when people make decisions for us and say, like back in the day, it was, you're disabled, you live in an institution, we're gonna segregate you and not show you to anybody, right? That still happens. We've come a long way, just so you know, it still happens, not quite as much. But that's why we say nothing about us without us. People with disabilities should be involved, fully involved and participating. And I know, just a little thing about language, inclusion is such a big word now, but I was an English major. I thought I was going to be an English teacher, then I became a journalist. So inclusion is a word, it's really big in the education system. I don't love it, because I feel like, you can include a lot of people in this room, whether they're disabled or from various cultures or marginalized populations. And just because you're included in the room doesn't mean you have equal opportunity to fully participate, and that includes like feeling safe to participate. So I just want to mention that that word inclusion bothers me somewhat. I think we need to go beyond that. And then one last thing about the philosophy, and we're gonna move into some more practical things. Like our philosophy, which has over the years now been translated into the major laws and approaches for how we solve equity problems around disability, is that the issue is not with disabled people or the disability itself, right? The problem is with barriers in our society, okay? And so, like somebody using a wheelchair faces barriers when there are stairs, right? But a building with 0-step entrance and there's no barrier, they can enter just like everybody else. And so the problem is with the way we design our buildings, programs, services, and traditionally have been designed really for one population in mind. It is, those without disabilities, oftentimes white, and, all of the kind of majority parts of the population. The solution is, and this is under the law, and the way the ADA and other laws approach it, is to remove barriers and create access. And we'll talk about that. I just want to say again, if we don't create them in the first place, that's really the ultimate solution, right? Kind of thinking about, as you design things, who are all the people who need to enter the building, use the service, use the program, and benefit from the materials, and you design it from the beginning for all people, right? Yes, that takes a little bit more planning and thought, and it might even cost a little bit more money, but I can guarantee you, and there are studies to prove it, it costs far less doing it that way than later having to remediate and rebuild things or do modifications, create new materials in alternative formats, those types of things. So the ADA, everybody knows the ADA, right? You've at least heard about it, passed in 1990. There are also other laws that follow the Americans with Disabilities Act, such as the Rehabilitation Act, Section 508, 504. If any of you work at entities that receive federal funding, any type of federal funding, you also must comply with 504 and 508, as well as some other laws. I want to emphasize about the ADA that it is a civil rights act. It was modeled in part after the Civil Rights Act. And so my pet peeve is when we hear that, oh, we don't need to widen doorways or put in a ramp because we were grandfathered. We existed before the ADA. There is no such thing as a grandfather clause to civil rights legislation. So I want you to think about that. When the civil rights was passed, can you imagine if it was like, oh, yeah, we don't need to comply because we existed prior to passage of the Civil Rights Act? It doesn't work that way. We're talking about our fundamental rights. And there are, different ways of compliance. Those entities that existed prior to 1990, there was a period for transitioning to full compliance. Passed in 90, this is 2024. There really shouldn't be any excuse for non-compliance, but we have yet to realize full compliance with that law. Okay. And so the ADA and similar laws prohibit discrimination in all aspects of public life. So that's state and local government, employment, public places of public accommodation. So that's everything else, basically. Movie theaters, restaurants, private medical care, telecommunications. And then, like I mentioned, federal government is covered under other laws. And the last thing is, the whole purpose is to provide equitable access so people get what they need to fully participate. And Arizona is also unique that we have a state law modeled after the federal law, and not every state does. And our state law actually provides some additional protections for individuals. 3 key things with the law, and I really don't like to talk about the law. I'd really rather talk about let's not create those barriers, right? But there are 3 ways that we have to ensure access under the law. Removing physical and architectural barriers, which I think most people are familiar with. The other is, and I like this graphic because it shows that brick wall, and basically whatever you need to do to get to the other side of it, you're expected to do to ensure equitable access. So remove barriers, provide reasonable modifications of policies, procedures, and practices. And so a quick example of that is like the pandemic. We're responding to a pandemic, and there were all the the pop-up clinics to do testing and vaccinations. Lots of inaccessibility because it was a pandemic, and it's like, hey, we have to do whatever we need to do. So an example of modifying a policy, procedure, or practice is at a clinic that maybe is not physically accessible to people using wheelchairs. The modification is that vaccinators go to that individual's car to do the vaccination. Or you can check in by phone. So it's, something different from your standard operating procedure, but whatever you need to do to provide access. And then lastly, effective communication, and that is a huge one, and that involves in providing auxiliary aids and services such as sign language interpreters. And what the law says is the communication with somebody with a disability, whether they're deaf, hard of hearing, have a cognitive disability, that communication is expected to be as effective as communication with somebody who does not have a disability. And you cannot require people to bring their own interpreters. Just want to say that. Lots of lawsuits around that. It is not disabled individuals' responsibility to bring an interpreter, to pay for an interpreter, bring an aid, pay for an aid. Not the disabled person's responsibility, up to all providers to create that access. And then last part of this is just that shift I mentioned. Back in the day, it was kind of medical model. You're disabled, there's something wrong with you. We need to fix you. You have an impairment, a deficit. And then, we see you as having a special need, and then often special programs, which special is just a euphemism for segregated. We've transitioned, though, as a result of the disability rights movement, to focusing on civil rights, and that is looking at optimal function of every human being, creating access, making sure everything is accessible, and focusing on social change. And then regarding that functional, maximum functioning.
Sure. So many of you may or may not have heard of the CMIST model, and that is a tool to basically a memory tool so that you can provide services or supports or resources to folks with disabilities during a disaster. So communication, maintaining health, independence, support, safety, and self-determination, and transportation. So communication, so not everybody can hear the alerts. Not everybody is going to be able to read the handouts you give them or understand messages or even verbalize their concerns. So you need to provide these auxiliary aids and have other solutions for folks, because everybody deserves to get the message regardless of their disability or non-disability. Go ahead. So maintaining health, many of you may take medicines, and some of you may need access to refrigeration for those medicines. Some folks with disabilities need access to power to run their life-saving devices. So that is where maintaining health comes in. Independence, of course, which we care about a lot. Ensure continuity of access and necessary equipment. We always say, don't separate someone from something that helps them live independently. It could be a service animal, it could be a caregiver, it could be an assistive device that helps them communicate. And then support safety and self-determination. So they may have lost caregiver assistance. They might need some safety support with that. It could be, child care that they need. And with self-determination, it kind of goes back to that independent living philosophy too, where we want people to be able to make their own decisions in things that impact their lives. And then transportation, of course, which is a huge deal. I know in every circle that I'm in, transportation is one of the biggest things. Like, how do we get people out? How do we get accessible transportation? So some folks might not be able to drive for one reason or another. If I didn't have my contact lenses in or glasses, I would not be able to drive. So I would need a transportation resource.
And just a note about that, there sometimes is an assumption that, if we provide like wheelchair accessible transportation, it's easy to evacuate people. But then you take somebody who uses a power wheelchair, is on a ventilator, uses a power lift to transfer from their wheelchair to anything else. So just kind of thinking about that day to day, it goes beyond one thing. Quickly, some pitfalls and best practices. Like the pitfalls, lack of planning for people with access and functional needs. So the best practice, plan and bring in people with lived experience, because that's how everybody learns and how we make things better. Limited coordination between emergency managers and disability service organizations. It's not just about planning. In an actual disaster, there may be resources that we can provide to the disability population that you don't know about. And so it really helps to coordinate. Lack of response communication. There are FEMA guidelines. We recommend following those. I'm going to go quickly. Training shelter personnel. And then, the communication access. This is huge. And so somebody might have some questions about that, but really providing communication access is critical, and that means a lot of different things in the community. And then the last three things that we have is just really emphasizing the whole community planning. So the principles of inclusive emergency management integration, establish an equity focus, which means involving everybody in the community. Like I said about if, all the people it might impact involve people with lived experience. That's how you get better planning, response, evaluation, everything, and build resilience. Partnering, actually looking to, people with lived experience as experts in their own lives, and partnering and developing new relationships and helping to continue to build the ones you have. And then synergy, and California has done a lot on this, and they have a lot of good results about when you do that and work as a community, you can just achieve better things, and it really does, give you better quality, better product, and help build resilience.
So we're going to leave you with a couple quotes here. So all too often, disaster-related needs of people with disabilities and older adults are overlooked and ignored. And then persons with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be injured in a disaster. So we'll move on to questions.
And we have, like I said, if you want the slides, we'll give them, and we do have our contact information there.
And
So,
then-
thank
go
you.
ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in your folder, there was information about AZ Silk. On the back of that, there's emergency preparedness information and how we do that emergency preparedness. So, and there's a link to the Partners in Preparedness webinar as well. So we have those every other month. Thank you.
So now we're going to start with some guided questions and kind of tailor the conversation a little bit more to wildfire and wildfire-related issues. And so our first question for the panel is, how can existing programs and policies for community wildfire preparedness be improved to more effectively address the unique needs of underserved populations in many of these folks' communities?
Sure. Great. When I first found out about community wildfire protection plans, you know, as a social scientist, I got really excited, and I started reading a lot of them, and I'm like, wait, like, where's the other part? Where's the community part? And I think they've done a really good job in kind of galvanizing people to think about where we need to do thinning, what's our kind of plan. But I think there's a really great opportunity to expand that out and bring in a lot of people and kind of consider it not as just something, you know, I think some communities it's like, oh, we need to check this box and we put it on the shelf and now we can qualify for grants. I mean, kind of think of it as like a living process that's constantly ongoing, updating, and evaluating. I think it has a potential to be a really amazing tool.
So I will add, you know, I think we all kind of emphasized involving the community members and people with lived experience. I want to emphasize like really involving, listening, and engaging people and allowing that full participation. There is nothing I like least than being window dressing and being that checkbox, oh, you're representing the disability community, and we're gonna have these meetings, but we're not really gonna do anything that you recommend or really hear you, right? And so I am an activist at heart, and that's like the last place you want me to be. You know, it's so much better if we can partner and be proactive instead of doing damage control later. And I kind of dated myself, but when I was living in California many decades ago, there was particular wildfires, and the response to disability was awful. And the disability community organized in the area, and we were trying to do damage control because so many people were evacuated without their equipment, without wheelchairs, walkers, medication. There was no access to a refrigerator for people who needed refrigerated medications. And people were literally dumped at a shelter and couldn't move because, and I realize in an actual disaster, it might be hard to evacuate somebody, say, in a power wheelchair. But ultimately, if you can do it, that is key, because if you evacuate people without that equipment, wherever you put them, they can't move, right? And so you want people to be as independent as possible. But then also having the backup equipment. So that was kind of what we did, the damage control. We ended up working with a hospital and a local airport to borrow lots of wheelchairs and equipment for this shelter, and lots of problem solving around all those issues.
Nothing about us without us.
Yes.
So I think also a lot of folks in this room constantly hear, involve the community, engage with everyone in your community, the whole community. And yet what advice or what proactive steps can leaders in this room take to really start building those relationships? Or how do they enter those spaces if maybe, there's those partnerships haven't been built already pre-disaster? How do they start kind of making those connections and building those relationships?
My phone number and email. I call, email, reach out. And And I say that because, so my center serves southeastern Arizona. And maybe, you're in Yuma, but I can certainly help connect you to, organizations in that area who then, are working with the access and functional needs population. Like, reach out to who you know to find the right people and invite us. Like, we want to be helpful. We really want to help create equity, and we don't want to go, I hate when I feel like I'm complaining about stuff all the time, and so I'd really rather work as a partner and be part of the solution. And just a quick example, the particular government entity I'm battling with right now, because I work with them regularly on things, but yet they launched this new online tool without telling us in advance, and it's something that everybody in the community needs to use, including disabled people, but launched it and didn't think about all the people that might use it. And so there's like an assumption that everybody in our community has access to the internet on a daily basis, has access to a computer or a smartphone. We in this room might, but that is not true for all of our population. Like, that's a huge assumption that the way people are going to get information or apply for something is online. That does not work for everybody. And it turns out it's not accessible to people using screen readers. And it's just like, why didn't, you know me. I serve on committees and commissions. Like, why not work with us in advance? I have an assistive technology trainer that could have tested it, and we could have identified problems before launching it and worked it out, instead of hearing me after the fact. Let's do it together and build it so people can use it.
I'm also not going to sugarcoat it. Working with people is hard. People are difficult. So, people want to be helpful, but it can be really hard. You need to invest a lot of time, and time means money. Like, it's unreal. A lot of some of these organizations, it's great, you guys have a lot of capacity. A lot of people who are working in small communities are already overloaded. And, I want you to partner, you're in charge of this now. Well, you gotta invest the money and the time to build these relationships. And you gotta kind of build on a common language as well. So at CLEMAS, we're very academic, we're all researchers, everyone's got a PhD, it's really annoying. But it's really hard to build a common language. Even if I'm gonna work with a climatologist and a hydrologist, we have an idea of what adaptation is, what resilience is. They're kind of common words, but they mean different things to different people. And you've really got to invest the time and build trust and build a common language. It's not easy.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, please reach out to me as well as Vicki. This is what I'm here for. This is what I get paid for. You're not bothering me. I will travel to you if you need me to. I've got business cards in the back. They got Braille on them and everything, so they're really cool.
One other thing about messaging and language, and you were talking about building a common language, just thinking about like disasters, emergencies, and putting out alerts and messaging, really remember that we all have our own lingo. And Stephanie came from emergency management, so when we do some of this stuff, I'll even ask her, I'm like, well, what exactly do they mean by that term? Even though I've heard it a lot, doesn't mean that I know, you throw out a term and probably everybody defines it different. And so we even talk about like independent living. That's lingo in the disability community. Other people don't know what we mean by that. So I just encourage you to think about, some of that language that is common for you in emergency management, disaster response, is not common to the general public, and really think about putting things in plain language. And then it makes it easy for them to be interpreted into other languages.
So I want this to be the most useful for you all. Does anyone in the crowd have Conrad? kick it off with you. Yeah, there's some mic runners.
So I heard the term planning several times. Vicki and Stephanie more directed towards. I'm curious if your sills and spills have an action arm. So, and I'll give you a scenario, 60% of Prescott is retired. Of that 60%, I am sure there's a significant portion that have disabilities. And I'm gonna use my neighbor Esther as an example. Wheelchair bound, heavy brush around her home. She's a caring, wonderful human being, really just got the non-renewal notification because her house is surrounded by brush. She'd love to be able to get out there and do that. She physically can't. Do you have an action arm that through New Horizons in Prescott Valley that would be able to get somebody out there and help her? Because for preventive, that's what I'm looking for, how to help my people.
So yes, it depends on like individual needs. And the only caveat for that from our perspective with the centers, like she would have to want it, right? Instead of you saying, hey, you need to do this. But if we connect with somebody and they're like, I'm not interested, we might try to do some education about, well, let's kind of think this through, but at the end of the day, it's their choice, and I'll say that can be the most frustrating part about, our jobs as well. And understanding that it is people's choice. Like our job is to make sure people can make fully informed choices. And that's a lot of work. But at the end, sometimes people make choices that we don't think are the best ones, but that's not for us to say. And so what we try to do is, just say like, whatever you think is best for you, and you can come back at any time. Sometimes people say, no, I don't want your help. And it's like, okay, as long as you feel comfortable, like we are always here. Like don't ever feel uncomfortable about reaching out again. We're always here to help.
Those are the phone calls I get.
Yeah.
The individual says, hey, Conrad, I want this to happen. I can't do it. What resource do you have for me?
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yes, so absolutely. If people are asking you for resources, I recommend connecting them to the Center for Independent Living. And if it's something they can't specifically help with, the other core service is information and referral. They're supposed to know their community and be able to connect people to necessary resources. And one thing you mentioned about retirees, and it was on the slide and I didn't say it, but disability is the equal opportunity minority experience. Because if you aren't born with one, don't acquire one through accident, illness, throughout your life, the chances you'll age into one are great. And I know somebody told me once that, oh, that's the most depressing thing. Well, that's because that's how we've been socialized. But if you think about disability being a natural part of our life experience, and it's not something that happens to other people, it happens to all of us, and our family members, friends, and ourselves included, and kind of accept that and get away from, oh my gosh, that's like the worst thing that could ever happen. Because it does. Like, I remember my grandma lived in one of those senior citizen apartment buildings, and this is before I was involved in disability rights, and I think back, they'd get together and play bingo and cards and whatever, and talk about who got a new wheelchair, who got a walker, who's using this piece of equipment. They never used the term disability or even the old H word, handicapped. It was just part of getting old, right? And so I think what's important that you mentioned is not everybody who has a disability or a functional need identifies as being disabled. And so that's part of the challenge with language too. Like we know that, and especially in certain communities, they do view disability still as a bad thing. And so then we have to think about other language and how to reach out to them and get them resources they need. And thank you for running the mics. That's important for access.
This came up in New Mexico just recently. I was in a meeting in the Santa Fe area with utilities companies, we're having conversations about public safety power shutoffs with our utilities, during really high wind events or, extreme fire danger type scenarios. And I was sitting there with Santa Fe County and folks from, the city of Santa Fe, and we're talking about how do we get information around where there are folks that have, life-saving equipment that they need. If we turn off their power, that can leave them high and dry, in a way that's really dangerous. And no one wanted to do that, of course. But there was a lot of conversation around, where do we get information around where there are people that have those needs, and how can we kind of work with utilities or, other folks to kind of relay that information and integrate it into our response plans. And I wonder, I wonder if one of you, knows kind of how that information might be, best accessed. Maybe folks in this room already do, but for me, that was something I was like, well, I know there's these networks, but I wasn't quite sure if that would be something that your organization can help with, or if you work with folks that have more of that kind of info. So that's my question.
I would say, reach out to the services, the service providers that are in your community. They know, and the Centers for Independent Living know the community makeup, and they're going to know, maybe they won't be able to tell you exactly where somebody lives, but they can tell you, there's a lot of folks in this area who rely on power. I'm just going to say registries don't work, and I know a bunch of you are going to hate me for that, but that gives people a false sense of security that people are going to come to save them, and we really want people to be prepared to, that we tell people, prepare like no one's coming. So that's why, you reach out to your local centers or other folks who provide services to the disability community and really get people to think about this and prepare, but also, you can find out a little bit more about the makeup of the community.
So Stephanie and I were exchanging looks because nothing gets my blood boiling more than power safety, power shutoffs right now. And so I'll just do a quick advertisement. The Arizona Disability Advocacy Coalition is actually planning a summit for March around emergencies and access and functional needs, and a portion of it will be about power outages in general, and another part specifically about the power safety, power shutoffs, which have been approved in Arizona. And apparently we didn't learn from the bad mistakes California has made, and we want to follow in their footsteps. So, and do damage control. Anyway, so we're having that summit. You'll probably all get information to learn more. With the registries, yes, people aren't always home when there's a disaster, right? So that's why there can be that false sense of security. But I have to tell you, there are also individuals who don't trust them because they're usually operated by government. And I'm not trying to bash government in any way, but we experience this with our home access program. We do our own process because if it has to go through the government entity that gives us the funding, people don't want the help. And then they're at risk of being in an institution instead of making their home accessible. And I'm not saying that for all people with disabilities. No, it's a small portion, but there are people, it's no, I don't want to be on a government registry. So there's just lots of views for that. The other thing I will say is it's not all your responsibility. So people who have that, need, we have a friend who's on a ventilator, he's an attorney, and he uses all kinds of equipment in his home to be independent. And we've talked about, if there's a power safety, power shutoff, which can last 4 to 5 days, as we've seen in California, he said, it would be devastating. He has some backup battery power to last a day or two, And that helps because that gives more time to figure out how to get him out. But he's not somebody who's just going to be able to evacuate just like that, and has to know where to go. But he also knows that it's his personal responsibility to plan. And so that's part of the philosophy too, is that, you know, you have to take personal responsibility to plan for yourself. And that's part of what we do too, is educating people. Like, don't sit at home thinking somebody's going to rescue you. You know, have a plan for if you do have to leave. And if you have a service dog or even a pet, you know, you have to plan for them. And I would say, like, you know, I'm much better at saying what people are supposed to do. I don't necessarily have all my stuff together if I needed to evacuate right away, but my dog does. I make sure that I plan for my pup. And so as I'm saying that, it's like, yeah, I need to get my act together too, but, you know, that's part of it. So.
Probably have time for one more question if there's any other questions lingering. Awesome. Well, please find these ladies after if you have any other more targeted questions. We're going to go into an early break. Just a little announcement. This is your opportunity to check out. Checkout is at noon.